Hello and welcome to Art Appreciation. This is FINA H101, presented by Indiana University-Purdue, University of Fort Wayne. My name is Dr. Aaron Schwartz, and we are at Week 9, Artist Representation Animation. So the topic for this week is animation, which means to give motion to inanimate objects. We'll be looking at 2- and 3-dimensional works of art, not film. But this presentation should nonetheless help you with your next writing assignment, and I suggest that you try to incorporate some of this week's vocabulary into those papers, maybe even reference one of the artworks that we looked at if it's helpful to you to something you're writing in your essay. So just keep that in mind as we move through this week's topic. So without any further ado, let's take a look at our first image. Our first work of art this week is by the Spanish painter Sanchez Cotan. It's a still life painted in 1602. Now, a still life, as you'll remember from week 1, means that by definition it's a depiction of inanimate objects that are not in motion. But in this case, I want you to consider how the artist does in fact animate them. How does he suggest motion or heighten the drama of these fruits and vegetables through their relative positions in the space of the painting? In other words, what clues is the artist giving us that there could be motion or there's about to be motion? Take a close look at that and see if you can figure out the tension of motion and potential here. Also think back to last week's image and think about space. What are some of the ways that the artist gives the impression of three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional picture plane, that is, on the flat surface of the painting? Why is it necessary that he gives the picture plane the illusion of 3 dimensions if he wants to suggest movement? So take a moment to think about those things as you look at this image, and then we'll move on to the next. So let's take a look at this image. We're going to be covering a lot of vocabulary in this slide, so you might want to have your list of terms handy. What we're looking at here is a Baroque sculpture made of marble that deals with the myth of Apollo and Daphne by the artist Bernini. Now, we've talked about Baroque art before as being highly dramatic and expressive, usually depicting twisting bodies and forms and displaying lots of emotion. When I talk about drama, by the way, what I'm referring to is a situation or series of events involving interesting or intense conflict, and there's certainly an interesting and intense issue being depicted here. Apollo and Daphne are figures from classical mythology. According to the myth, the god Apollo had been shot by one of Cupid's arrows, so he was hopelessly in love with Daphne, who was a wood nymph. But she wanted nothing to do with him or any other man, preferring instead to explore the woods on her own. Apollo, though, followed her incessantly, and one day began to chase her. She ran, but seeing he was about to catch her, she called out to her father, a river god named Peneus, for help, saying, "Do something! Change me so he doesn't want me anymore." Suddenly she began to sprout leaves from her fingertips, and her skin began to turn into bark. Her feet turned into roots that burrowed into the ground, and she was transformed into a laurel tree. Apollo couldn't exactly marry a tree, but because of Cupid's arrow he still loved her, so he changed her into an evergreen in order to give her everlasting life. What you see here is the moment when Apollo reaches out to Daphne as she turns into a tree. Now these figures are stuck in time and space. They're made of marble after all. But how did Bernini animate the figures to give them the appearance of motion? How do the diagonals that Bernini makes this more animate? Diagonals are straight lines that cut through space or picture plane at a 90-degree angle. How is the action balance? Balance refers to elements of compositions being in equilibrium. Also, make sure you look closely at the details of these figures' facial expressions. That is, the motion executed with facial muscles that convey an emotional state to observers, and their physical gestures. How do all of these factors combine to give the impression of motion and heighten the drama of the scene? A narrative painting is the representation of an event or story, but not all narrative paintings depict stories that have the quality of drama. So remember, a drama is a situation or series of events involving interesting or intense conflict of sources. The painting we're looking at here is by the Baroque artist Caravaggio and is called Madonna of the Pilgrims from about 1604 to 05. Based on what you see here, and not knowing any of the story, do you think this is a drama or simply a narrative? In your answer, you'll want to consider your observations of the figures, their facial expressions, as well as the artist's gesture. So the gesture is a technique where the actual physical movement of the artist is reflected in the artwork. And of course the brush strokes, which is the way the paint is applied through the movement of a paintbrush across the surface. Also look for the way that the artist has used diagonals or straight lines in the composition. Just to clue you in a bit on the subject matter of the painting, what you see here is this Christian painting is the Virgin Mary in the dark blue robe and halo, standing on a doorstep holding out the Christ child to show him to two peasants who are what we call pilgrims, meaning they traveled a long way out of religious belief to make this visit. Notice that Caravaggio has depicted Mary as a humble woman, no grander than the visiting pilgrims. She is barefoot, and the home behind her is decrepit and dirty. The pilgrims, too, are barefoot with dirty feet exposed to the viewer, so Caravaggio has painted this religious scene in a way that places the religious figures in the context of everyday peasant life in the 17th century, a tactic that would have been quite edgy, if not actually offensive, in his time. Now knowing this about the image, do you still agree with the original impression of whether this is a drama or a narrative? How much action is actually taking place here, and does the action affect your reading of the scene's drama? Take a moment to jot down some notes on that. This painting is called Peasants' Wedding and is by the 16th century Dutch artist Peter Bruegel the Elder. Bruegel was known in his time for his genre paintings, which portray popular culture and everyday life, rather than religious or mythological scenes. As you look carefully at this painting, you can find a lot of details and quirky implied stories within the overall scene. There are just over 40 figures depicted here, and all seem to be engaged in some kind of action. Eating, drinking, talking, just taking in the scene itself. There's so much going on, and so much of it is animated, that you can almost hear the clanking of dishes and the laughing and chatting of the banqueteers. This is full of what we call anecdotal detail, which is defined as a short story or very short narrative of an interesting or amusing personal incident. Sometimes an anecdotal detail just captures a moment that out of context would seem mundane. Now the main event depicted here is a wedding feast. The bride is seated in front of a green cloth. She's not at the very center of the action or of the composition, but in your opinion, do you think she is still the focal point, or the center of interest or activity in the work of art? Consider why you might think so, and how Bruegel has or has not created this impression. And where is the groom? Do you think that one of the men in this painting is the groom? And if so, what makes you think this? By the way, this is something of a mystery associated with this painting. Nobody quite knows the correct answer, so your guess is as good as anyone else's. You might also want to share in your notes and be thinking where your eyes were first drawn to when you looked at this painting, and if they stayed there or began to wander across the room. Lastly, consider, did you miss finding the bride completely when you first looked at this? Did you even notice her? Why might that have happened, and why do you think Bruegel made the central figure in this painting so hard to spot? What's the point in doing this? So take a moment to compose your thoughts and consider your first reaction and how your eyes moved across the scene when it first came up. This is a short passage from the book of Genesis in the Bible. Just take a few seconds to read this, because the next image we look at is going to deal directly with this passage. Sometimes a narrative tells a story by illustrating multiple scenes within a single frame, or it shows earlier and later parts of the story in one frame. When this happens, it's called continuous narrative, and you can see it here in this early Christian mosaic from the 6th century, which depicts the biblical hospitality story you just read on the previous slide from the book of Genesis. Let's try to match up the actions in the text to what is depicted in the mosaic. Now here's a hint. Abraham is depicted twice. He's an old man with white hair and a white beard. Each time he's depicted, you're looking at a different scene, a later part of the story. So take a moment to take a look here and try to figure out where you see Abraham and where you feel the scene has shifted from one part of the story to another part of the story. And take a moment to really feel how that works here and how the artist is composing the scene in a continuous narrative. Artists employ various techniques in animating or telling a story. This is called narrative style, which can be simply defined as the way in which an artist tells a story. Before I tell you the story depicted here, I'd like you to consider and jot down in your notes, what kind of narrative do you see? Is this a continuous narrative, anecdotal detail, drama? And what are some of the elements of animation we've talked about that you can identify here? Three-dimensionality, diagonals, brushstroke, facial expression, gesture. How would you describe this narrative style? So this painting is by the French neoclassical painter Jacques-Louis David, and it's called The Lictors Returning to Brutus the Bodies of His Sons. It's a painting of an ancient historical event. Lictors are ancient Roman officers, and Brutus was said to have overthrown the Roman kings and helped establish the Roman Republic, which he believed to be a more fair form of government. However, his sons betrayed him and tried to overthrow the new republic and restore control to the kings. Brutus was a judge, and he actually had to pass judgment on his own sons for their dissent against the government, for treason. He had to condemn them to death. In this painting, you see one of the bodies being brought through the doorway. He's been beheaded. Brutus is in the left front corner with his legs crossed, looking anxious and looking away. On the right is Brutus's wife and daughters, the mother and sisters of the condemned. Now that you know the story, is it more dramatic? Do you notice any features of narrative or animation that you didn't see before? So take a moment in your notes to describe how knowing the story has affected your reaction to the painting. Our final slide has 3 Christian artworks. The first 2 are from the early Christian period, from the 500s to 600s AD. They both showed the adoration of the Magi. Magi are part of the nativity stories that tells of Jesus Christ's birth. They are also known as the 3 wise men or the 3 kings who came to visit Jesus when he was born. The artwork on the far right is a sculpture of Mary and Jesus from around the 12th century. The first work, the medallion, is highly animated. The angel sits and flutters in the sky. The wise men are walking forward, chattering amongst themselves as they approach the Virgin and baby Jesus, who sit under the star that the Magi followed to find them. It tells a story. By the way, the Greek writing at the bottom of the gold pendant says, "Lord, protect the wearer." It does not say anything about the narrative it shows. The second piece is more static. There's less activity, but the entire story of Jesus' birth is depicted in continuous narrative in different parts of the image. At the very bottom left, you see the Virgin reclining on a mattress, and to the right is the manger with a star above it, animals flanking it, and baby Jesus laid out with one of the Magi kneeling down before him. The focal point here is the main scene above, depicting the Virgin and Child, looking out at the viewer rather than interacting with the Magi. The story really stops with them. They cease to continue the action. Just to review, a focal point is a center of interest or activity in a work of art. And here, there is such a focus on them because this artwork is an icon. Icon literally means image. It's defined as a work of art representing a sacred figure or scene that is used for devotional purposes. In this case, the worshiper would pray to the Virgin. Now the final artwork on the far right just shows the Virgin and Child without the rest of the story. This was truly intended to be worshipped directly. So in your notes, as you look at these images, I'd like you to consider which of these is a narrative. Before you discount the final image on the right, consider whether a worshiper kneeling in front of this piece might have become part of a living narrative. At what point can a viewer become part of the action of the artwork? So take a moment to consider these and consolidate your thoughts on them in your notes. And that will conclude our Week 9 lecture. Please make sure you're participating in the Blackboard activities. If you have any questions or concerns about any of those things, email me as soon as you can. Either myself or my teaching assistant will try to solve any of those issues right away. So that's it for this week. Thank you very much. Until next week, I'll talk at you later.